Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Islam at the Crossroads by Mohammed Asad. Mohammed Asad is one of the most remarkable lives of the 20th century. He lived a very famous and a very remarkable life that many Muslims would have not lived in the 20th century. Born an Austo-Hungarian Jew called Leopold Weiss, he converted to Islam and traveled around the world and took part in many of the important historical events of our contemporary Muslim world. Apart from supporting the Muslim nations in setting up of the post-colonial world, he wrote a number of Islamic works. One is this, The Crossroads of Islam. Another important book, a great translation of the Holy Quran, The Message of the Quran, which is still a well-read, well-famous English translation. Then he wrote his autobiography, The Road to Mecca, which is one of the most interesting autobiographies that I've ever read. This erudite book, wrote in 1935, was an appeal to the Muslims of the 20th century to return back to their tradition, to return back to their original sources of the religion, rather than being motivated or rather than being attracted towards the materially ascendant Western civilization. Though it was written in the 20th century, I believe that this book is still relevant. It can still be read, understood, and practically implemented, because we Muslims of the 21st century too have the same struggles, even though there are some differences between the 20th century and the 21st century Muslims. So Asad makes some key arguments in this book, and I'm going to take you through this intellectual journey chapter by chapter very briefly. Come, let's embark on the journey. Starting with chapter 1, The Open Road of Islam, Asad explores the idea about the conquest of space, rapid communication, and many other things that define the modern age. But specifically, he criticizes the influence of Western civilization on the Muslim world, especially culturally. He says that the Muslim world does not have an evident influence over the Western civilization, but the Western civilization has an influence culturally onto the Muslim world. He goes on to explain that Islam is not just a spiritual attitude, rather it is a self-sufficing orbit of its own nature that has its own culture, that has its own social values, where Muslims need not to go to any other civilizations to be attracted to follow to. But he criticizes the Muslims for being so, to follow the Western civilizations a lot. Further on, he goes on in explaining the idea about Islam's view on life, the purpose of life and everything. He says that Islam answers all psychological, physiological and biological needs of human beings in a more holistic manner than any other religions, and it composes all parts of human life. It can be physical, mental, spiritual, or any sort of thing completely. So again, he explains this very particularly, saying that Islam weaves salvation not through suppressing the desires outrightly, rather navigating the desires in the correct manner. So you can have personal traits within yourself, but it should be navigated, it should be guided through the spiritual realm, the guidance of the Quran and Sunnah, the framework of the Quran and Sunnah. Moving on to chapter 2, he explains a stark differences between the Islamic civilization and the Muslim civilization. To chapter 2, Asad discusses some stark differences between the Muslim civilization and the Western civilization. The first thing that he comes out is the idea that Islam is a full and full theocratic religion, where God's law, the Sharia, reigns everything what Muslims do and what Muslims shouldn't do. But on the opposite, the Western civilization does not have any God law for them. So actually, the Western civilization is moved by dynamic evolution, which is detached from moral perspectives, which is detached from purpose of life, unless it is materialistically oriented. But Islam is not so. It's more than material orientation for human life. So that is why he comes out with some examples of the Western civilization, and he even says that Soviet Union is, even though it has differences than Western civilization, still it is a materially oriented country or a nation which is anti-religious. So he says that both the Western civilization and the Soviet Union are both anti-religious in that sense, and he proposes and comes up with some examples like the idea about gender, the idea about family, the idea about sex and everything has issues within the Western civilization, because they do see progress and dynamic evolution based on material things, based on technological development, based on praising buildings, where there is no moral perspective, there is no moral compass for them to decide their next stage of life. But Islam, or for Muslims, that's not the case. You have a moral compass, you have your divine law, the Quran and the Sunnah, to guide people, to guide Muslims into the path that is expected by God itself. Moving on with that, next further, he goes into a clear historical analysis about the centuries-old animosity of the Western civilization towards the Islamic civilization, towards Islam and the Muslims. Asad says that crusades played a major role in creating the collective psyche of the Western civilization, that is the hatred towards the Muslim civilization from the Western civilization. He says that crusades made a major role in playing that part, and along with that he extends this criticism to the Orientalists too, saying that the Orientalists who studied Islam, who studied the faith from an Oriental lens, were biased on some sense, where they picked and choose verses for their own things. They studied the narratives from their own perspective rather than from the original sources or from the original authorities of Islam, which created a more negative picture about the religion. And moreover, he says that this divisiveness between the Western civilization and the Muslim civilization widened more with the fall of Spain and the capture of Constantinople by the Muslims, which again gave more divisiveness to the progress. And all in all, we are still facing this divisiveness among us, which the Western civilization is having a hatred towards the religion. Moreover, finally he concludes that chapter saying that even though there are some positive aspects coming from the Western civilization regarding Islam, overall you cannot expect that the Western civilization would have a very positive view about Islam, because the Western civilization is basically embedded in a materialistic civilization, whereas Islam is not so. It is more spiritual, it is more towards purposeness of life, which has two different distinct worldview from the very beginning. In chapter 4 regarding education, Asad proposes and comes up with some ideas relating to how Western academia, Western education impacts the Muslim society. First and foremost, he says that Western academia would undermine a Muslim youth's idea about God, about philosophy, regarding religion, about prophethood, and they are representatives of God and everything. So he says it undermines their belief, and then he goes on to explain that both civilizations has two clashing worldviews. So it's not expected that two clashing civilizations would have coexisting educational methodologies. So he proposes that Muslim civilization should be cautious on the Western educational system. And then he says that there is a growing trend of educated Muslims being less devoted in their faith because of the environment of the Western academia, because of the culture of the Western academia, and it impacts their religion, it impacts their mentality about religion and their belief about religion. So he proposes that Muslims should be cautious on the religion, and he goes on to explain that studying natural sciences are not of a serious issue, but studying philosophy, literature and many other things related to basic human life would make you question question their religion itself. And he says history should be reinterpreted, history should be retaught in the proper manner, world history and everything. And finally he concludes the chapter with the note of Islam's moral superiority regarding brotherhood, regarding equality, regarding fraternity and everything, comparing it with the class struggles and the slave issues and many other societal issues in the Western civilization. Moving on from chapter 4, he goes on to chapter 5, where he discusses the problem, the perilous issue of Muslims imitating the West without any limit at all. So he questions this, and he says this would lead to disaster for the Muslim civilization. He says that Muslims incline towards the Western civilization because of its materially ascending development, and because that they think that it's the epitome of success. And he challenges that narration that material development is not development 100%. And then he says that adopting Western social economic rules without understanding the Islamic rules regarding it is misunderstanding, and it is misguidance from the sources of the religion itself. So you go from your source to another source, and he criticizes it. He questions that. And then he says that civilizations are living organisms. Civilizations are living organisms, and if you externally follow their footsteps, then it might impact you mentally too, because their external portrayal of certain things would assimilate you with your mentality, with your culture. For example, he brings out the idea about dress code, and he says that each and every civilization has their own way of dressing based on their philosophy, idea and everything. So if you want to follow the Western civilization 100%, then it might assimilate with your religious idea, with your mentality, with your culture, and this is not good. And he says you should be protective even on the external sense too, not on the philosophical or the moral or the theoretical sense only. Then he says that Muslims should never feel inferior because that there is no much materialistic development within the Muslim society. Rather, he says that Muslims should come back to their sources and develop more and try to regain their civilization what they have lost in the course of the history. Finally, he gives, before moving into the conclusion, he gives a very clear picture on how Sunnah can rejuvenate Islamic civilization and bring back the civilization to its earlier form. Here he speaks a lot on Sunnah, the importance of Sunnah, the role of Sunnah, the authenticity of Sunnah. He says that Sunnah basically is the words and the actions of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which are being protected authentically, and he proves it. He proves it like, the content is being tested and tested by a lot of muhaddith, by a lot of people who are experts of hadith, and it has been the chain of narration, the rawi and the narrators are being tested a lot. So likewise he says the authenticity of Sunnah is 100%, and you cannot challenge it. And he challenges the Western civilization or some Muslims who are westernized to bring out clear scientific arguments and to show why Sunnah cannot be credible at all. He says you cannot discredit the authenticity of the Sunnah. Furthermore, he says that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a person who portrayed the teachings of the Quran. So if you want to follow the Quran, you need to follow the Sunnah. Both are interconnected. He was a living interpretation of the Quran. So you have to embody both the Quran and the Sunnah, and you cannot select one out of both. And at the same time, he says Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's teaching was all focused. It was on spiritual needs, it was on material needs, it was on mental needs, psychological needs. So it's all composing, it's perfect. So there's no need that you need to go for any other examples, because you have a perfect example based on divine law, based on divine rules, and you can easily follow his
advice on each and everything. Furthermore, finally, he proposes and he comes up with the idea that Muslims or humans have limited knowledge and you have limited rationality, so you cannot follow, so you cannot understand the purpose of life, and you cannot decide everything on life just based on your logical sense. So there should be a superpower guiding you, and he says Sunnah plays this role. Sunnah supports everything. Sunnah guides on all spheres of life, and it has been guiding for the last 1400 years, and it is still practical because it is divine. Because it is divine, and we have an intellectual obligation to follow it, to follow the Sunnah for the betterment of our society, for the betterment of the individuals, and for the betterment of the society too. Lastly, he concludes the book with some strong notes saying that cultures and civilizations come and go, but Islamic civilization is not just a mere culture as other cultures in the history. It is a culture it is a civilization that was inspired by revealed knowledge. So he says Muslims to go back to that revealed knowledge, to thrive back its lost civilizational capabilities, to come back to its former position. And he says it would be valid until the day of judgment, because there is nothing called as used Islamic civilization, or it's being passed, nothing like that. It's still there, it's still present. It's just the Muslims need to go back to the original source and thrive back and develop themselves and regenerate the Islamic civilization what is lost. And then he concludes this book with the final note that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the best example for you from the Quranic words, and finishes the book. So I think that's all from me. This is just a short wrap up of the idea about the book. I gained a lot from the book. I expect that you read the book and you gain more from it, and you inspire other people too regarding this idea. So that's all from me. Thank you. Jazakumullah khair.